Hi, this is JD, and in this lecture we're going to look at solving quadratic equations.
So here's a little preview, and we're not going to go over all of these because we've already went over one. So we're going to look today at how to solve quadratic equations, and there's mainly four ways to solve a quadratic equation. One we already learned, and that is how to solve by factoring. We're going to look at square root property, completing the square, and then also the quadratic formula. So what is a quadratic equation? Quadratic equation is in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. It's second degree, meaning the highest degree that it has is a 2. Right, the x is squared, so it has a degree of 2, it's second degree. And then a, b, and c are real numbers. And then a cannot equal 0. Once a equals 0, it's no longer a quadratic. So here's one way to solve a quadratic is by using a square root property. So let me get the laser pointer. So if x squared equals a, and then what you can do is take the square root of both sides and you end up with x equals plus or minus the square root of a. So let's look at an example. X squared equals 20. Take the square root of each side. You end up with x on the left-hand side because the square root and the square are opposites of one another. They cancel each other out. And then because of the cancellation here and using the square root property, you end up with this plus or minus. Now you can simplify this. This should remind you of a previous section that we went over. I can take the 20 and I can split up as 4 and 5. Take the square root of each of these. Square root of 4 is 2. Square root of 5 is square root of 5. So I have x equals plus or minus 2 square root of 5. That plus or minus is plus or minus. So that would be our solutions, a positive 2 square root of 5 or negative 2 square root of 5. All right, let's look at some more examples. And so let's look at 3 and how to use the square root property. Let's look at the first one. So first one, you want to, whenever you have like a square, you want to isolate it. So you want to add 55 to both sides. You get 5x squared equals 55. Next, you want to get rid of this 5. So you divide both sides by 5. End up with x squared equals 11. And I took the square root already, so take the square root of each side and you end up with x equals plus or minus the square root of 11. For b, take the square root of both sides. Right, you want to do the opposite, so you want to cancel that square out. So cancel those out, you end up with x plus 2 plus or minus square root of 18. I want to simplify the 18, 9 times 2. So that would be, I guess I didn't do it here yet, but subtracted 2 from both sides. There we go. So 18 is made up of 9 and 2. So that would be square root of 9 is 3. Square root of 2 would just be 2. And that's it. And you can write these separately. So it would be, here would be square root of 11 or negative 11, negative square root of 11. Here it would be negative 2 plus 3 square root of 2, and that, or negative 2 minus 3 square root of 2. It's plus or minus, like what I have there. Now let's take the square root of both sides here. When you do that, notice that you end up with a square root of a negative number. The square root of a negative number is not real. And in this course, you don't have to deal with imaginary numbers. So you can kind of, you can ignore that. But you still need to be able to identify when you don't have a real number. All right, let's look at another method. We're going to be looking at what's called completing the square. This is how it works, and I'll show you the steps. So step number 1 is divide everything, every term, by the coefficient of x squared, unless it's 1. Isolate all variables, variable terms to one side, means put your constants on the other side. Add both sides by half of b squared. Use b half, or b divided by 2, and the whole thing squared. Step 4, factor the trinomial, write it as a square, use b over 2. And step 5 is use the square root property to solve for x. Basically what you're doing in this one is you're using the fact that it is an equation, and you're inserting a number on both sides to make one side a perfect squared trinomial. Now the factoring is always the same, so it's not like you have to do extra factoring here, but that's what you're doing. You're factoring the trinomial, you're setting up the, you're factoring the perfect squared trinomial, and then you apply the square root property and you simplify it. Solve for x. All right, so that first example. So here, look for something different besides 1 in front, so I don't have to divide everything. Now what I want to do next is I want to take half of b. Half of b is the middle term, so half of 8 is 4, and then you square it, it's 16. And that's what you want to add to both sides. Now this ends up being 17. This is a perfect squared trinomial. So you took half of b, you're going to use that. So you're going to use 4. So to factor it would be x plus 4, but you can write it as x plus 4 parentheses squared equals 17. And then what you can do is use the square root property, take the square root of both sides, and you end up with x plus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 17. Solve for x, so get rid of the 4, so you subtract 4 from both sides, and you get x equals negative 4 plus or minus square root of 17. Let's do the same thing here, but first what we're going to have to do is take this 2 over to the right-hand side. I don't know why. Oh, because I'm taking half. So half of negative 5 is 5 halves, and negative 5 halves squared is 25 over 4. So you're going to add that to both sides. Now on this side, negative 2 plus 25 over 4, maybe it's a while since you did a fraction, but you can change this to negative 8 over 4. Negative 8 over 4 plus 25 over 4 gives you 17 over 4. Remember what I said about b. is you're going to use that with the half of b, you're going to use that with factoring. So you can just write this as y minus 5 halves parentheses squared. Take the square root of both sides. Square root of 17 is square root of 17. Square root of 4 is 2. So that's why it's simplified there. The square root and the square cancel each other out. So next what we do is we want to isolate the y, so we would add 5 halves to both sides. So we end up with y equals 5 halves plus or minus square root of 17 over 2. Here's another method, and the bonus about this method, just like completing the square method, you can use it for any quadratic equation. The only square root property has a certain form. The completing the square kind of adjusts it so that you can use the square root property. But the other way would be solved by factoring, and the only way that you can solve a quadratic by factoring is that if it's factorable. But using the quadratic formula, you can use it for any quadratic equation. So here are the steps. Step 1, solve for 0. Step 2, find A, B, and C in the quadratic equation. A, B, and C are the coefficients in front of the numbers. So in front of the variables. You're not going to use x squared or x. That's what the formula is set for. That's what you're trying to solve. Plug everything in, apply the formula, and simplify it. And the formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So let's solve using the quadratic formula. So first find your a, your b, and your c. So a equals 5, b equals negative 8, and c equals 3. Plug all of those into the quadratic formula. That's the quadratic formula. Negative b plus or minus, that's incorrect. Let's see, I'll just put this pen here. This should just be a positive, and that should be plus or minus. All right, so it turned out correct over here. So plug everything in. If it's negative, like the b, use parentheses. So I have negative 8 plus or minus square root negative 8 squared minus 4 times 5 times 3 all over 2 times 5. Now what I would do is with this, the quadratic formula, do the square root to the side. So negative 8 squared, whole thing squared is 64. 4 times 5 times 3 is 60. So 64 minus 60, we call order of operations, right? You have to do the exponent first and then multiplication. Then subtract. 64 minus 60 is 4. Square root of 4 is 2. Now simplify this. So the opposite of negative 8 is 8 plus or minus 2. And then 2 times 5 is 10. So I have x equals plus or minus 2 over 10. I can then split that up because with the plus or minus, so I have x plus 2 over 10 or x minus 2 over 10. Continue to simplify that. That would be 10 over 10. This would be 6 over 10. Simplify each of those. 10 over 10 is 1. And 6 over 10 would be 3/5. So those are my answers, 1 and 3/5. Now, it's not necessary for you to check your answers here because the domain is not restricted. So you can if you want. The way that you would do is you plug these in separately. So you plug in 1 to all the x's, and then you would also plug in 3/5 into all the x's, and doing it at separate times, not all at once. So that's it. Let's review. Solve by factoring. That's what we saw in a previous unit. I think it was right before the midterm that we looked at solve by factoring, but you can certainly use that here. We looked at the square root property. Square root property is you take the square root of both sides, the square root cancels out with the square, leaving you with plus or minus. We looked at completing the square. Completing the square, first divide off the coefficient of x squared, then take whatever the middle term is, whatever is, well, you want to move all your variable terms to one side and all your constants to the other side. You take half of b, square it, add that to both sides, then you factor the trinomial using b over 2, or half of b, using that, and then take the square root of both sides, simplify, solve for x, and then you have the quadratic formula. You don't have to do completing the square. You can use the quadratic formula if you want. So the quadratic formula is you have to put it in quadratic form first, which means that would be ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Key thing is setting it equal to 0. Find out what your a is, your b, and your c, plug it into the quadratic formula, and that will give you your solutions. And that's it.
If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you have any questions, put them in the comments below. Thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.